Next up is the stomach. Okay? So the stomach has a pretty extensive mucosa lining it, and it really needs that mucosa because the mucosa, as I said before, is very protective against self-digestion. And the pH in the stomach is very, very, very low. And without this nice mucosa protective layering, then we would be constantly digesting our own stomach. I mean, we do constantly digest our own stomach. However, we don't do it nearly as much as we would if we didn't have this mucosa liner. So the job of the mucosa is not only to protect, but it does also secrete gastric juice into the stomach lumen. So gastric juice, and I know it's weird that we call it juice, but that's just what we call it. Gastric juice is a combination of many different things which are going to be used to help digest the food in the stomach. So one of the things in gastric juice is a pre-enzyme called pepsinogen. So pepsinogen itself doesn't really do anything, but once it's released into the acidic environment of the stomach, it becomes activated, and its new form, its active form, is called pepsin. And pepsin is an enzyme that will help to break down protein. Another component to gastric juice is acid, hydrochloric acid. So cells of the mucosa produce the components to the hydrochloric acid and then squirt that into the gastric juice. And as I mentioned before, this acid helps to denature our biological molecules in our food, which makes it easier to digest them. The mucosa also produces mucus, which is mostly there to protect the stomach from self-digestion. The cells of the mucosa in the stomach are capable of absorbing some nutrients, and they are capable of absorbing water, but they don't do a lot of nutrient absorption. Most of the nutrient absorption is going to occur in the small intestine. Also in the mucosa of the stomach, we're going to find a cell type called a G cell. And the G cells are important because they actually produce a hormone called gastrin, hence the name G cell. And gastrin is a hormone that is going to increase the secretion of gastric juice into the stomach. So these G cells, when they release the gastrin, it goes to the neighboring cells and basically tells them to make more gastric juice. So the stomach does have a layer of muscle, and it has actually a very extensive layer of muscle in its wall, much more extensive than many other parts of the digestive tract. And this muscle goes in many different directions, which allows the stomach to do lots of different types of contractions in order to mix the food up very well with the gastric juice. As the food becomes mixed with the gastric juice, it starts to form something called chyme. So chyme is our new name for food as it leaves from the stomach and enters into the small intestine. So the stomach is going to gradually release chyme into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. And it does this by contraction and relaxation of yet another sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter is the gateway between the stomach and the small intestine. So we do have quite a bit of regulation of stomach activity. Most of this will occur through the nervous system and the endocrine system. The hypothalamus, located in the brain, does a lot of monitoring of our gastric situation. So it can actually sample the blood and sample cerebrospinal fluid to find out what kind of nutrients are present, and then it can kind of dictate what sort of things need to happen based on what's in the blood, or maybe what's not in the blood, or cerebrospinal fluid. So when we begin eating, the medulla oblongata will also become involved. So don't forget the medulla oblongata is part of the brain stem, and it is involved with many of our autonomic functions. And most of what happens in the digestive system is very involuntary, so it will be controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So the medulla oblongata is going to send signals through a cranial nerve down to the stomach. And it's going to basically send a signal to the stomach telling the stomach to increase the release of gastric fluid. Because if we're eating, then we're going to need to make lots of gastric fluid in order to start to digest that food. Also, the presence of the food in the stomach causes the G cells that are in the mucosa of the stomach to release their hormone gastrin. And don't forget, the job of gastrin is to travel to neighboring cells in the mucosa and tell them to release more gastric fluid. Now, once that food in the stomach is partially digested, it's released via the pyloric sphincter into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. And once that chyme enters the duodenum of the small intestine itself will release several enzymes, which are also going to be involved with the process of digestion. So one of the main enzymes released by the small intestine is called CCK, and the full name is cholecystokinin. And CCK has another hormone it works with that's also released by the small intestine, and that's called gastric inhibitory peptide, also known as GIP. And these two hormones together play some major roles with digestion. One of the things that these hormones do is they send signals to the stomach, because don't forget, hormones are chemical messengers. They send signals to the stomach telling the stomach to stop producing gastric secretions and to stop contracting. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Once the food leaves the stomach and enters into the small intestine, we don't really need the stomach to produce gastric juice anymore, and we don't really need the stomach to contract anymore. So once the food is present in the small intestine releases these hormones, CCK and GIP, and those travel through the bloodstream to the stomach and tell the stomach to turn off because there's not any food in there anymore. And don't forget, hormones are usually released into a body fluid such as blood. So these hormones are not being released into the food or into the gastric juice, right? They're going to be released into the extracellular fluids, usually blood, and then they travel to their targets through the blood. And while we're talking about the stomach, we should probably mention vomiting. Vomiting is also known as emesis, right? Obviously, this is something that occurs when there's an infection in the digestive tract or if there is a toxin in the digestive tract. Antiemetics are drugs that stop vomiting. So if you ever hear that term antiemetic, it's just referring to something that stops vomiting from occurring. Next up is the small intestine. And the small intestine's job is to complete the process of digestion. So it completes the digestion of the chyme that it receives from the stomach. And then it has to absorb the nutrients, which is a really important job, to take those nutrients out of what was food and now bring it into the cells of the body. There's going to be some stuff left over that we can't actually absorb. So those are undigested residues, which we call fiber, and the small intestine has to transport this undigested residue to the large intestine too. There are three parts to the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So the duodenum is the first few inches of the small intestine. It's the part of the small intestine that is attached to the stomach. Okay? The next would be the jejunum, and then last is the ileum. So when the stomach releases chyme, the chyme enters into the duodenum. So when chyme enters the duodenum is going to release hormones. So I mentioned the hormone CCK before. So when chyme enters the duodenum releases CCK into the bloodstream, and this is a hormone that travels to the stomach and it turns off the stomach because there's no food in the stomach anymore. But CCK has another job too. It also travels to the pancreas, and it tells the pancreas to release pancreatic juice into the duodenum. And pancreatic juice is really important because it contains a lot of digestive enzymes, and it is really important for finishing up the process of digestion in the duodenum. So without that pancreatic juice and all those digestive enzymes, we can't actually properly digest our food. In addition to having enzymes in the pancreatic juice, we also have buffers. So these are really important too, because it turns out that most of the enzymes that are released into the pancreatic juice, these enzymes will only work at a neutral pH, so at a pH close to 7. And if you recall, the pH in the stomach was around 2. So this chyme that's entering into the duodenum is very, very, very acidic. So we kind of need to buffer that pH. And so the buffers from the pancreatic juice will change the pH from 2 to closer to 7 so that these digestive enzymes can function properly. Additionally, the gallbladder will be releasing bile into the duodenum. And the gallbladder is a little storage sac that stores and concentrates something called bile. And bile is an important component for digesting lipids. And it's actually made in the liver. Bile is made in the liver, but it's stored in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder will squirt the bile into the duodenum once food is in the duodenum. and the bile helps to emulsify fats. And emulsification is just a fancy word to say that it helps to mix fats in with water. And this is important because most of the digestive enzymes that are there to break fats down, those digestive enzymes only work well in a watery environment. And fats are fats, they don't like water. So these emulsifiers in the bile help to mix our fats from our food in with the watery environment inside the duodenum so that the lipases, the fat digesting enzymes, have access to those lipids. Once food leaves the duodenum, it enters into the next part of the intestine, which is the jejunum. And in the jejunum, we wrap up the process of digestion and do quite a bit of absorption. And then the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine, does lots and lots of absorption. At that point, we have a lot of residues left over, these undigested residues, and those need to be passed on to the large intestine. So there is yet another sphincter between the small intestine and the large intestine, and this is called the Ileocecal Valve. And even though it's called a valve, it really is truly a sphincter. And so this particular sphincter is the gateway between the ileum, hence Ileocecal Valve, and the first part of the large intestine called the cecum, hence the cecal part of cecal valve. Before we leave the small intestines, I want to talk a little bit more about absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. Right? There's a very large amount of surface area in the small intestine, and this large amount of surface area is there just to increase nutrient absorption. So there's about 300 square feet of surface area in the small intestine. This is the size of an apartment. I mean, this is a pretty large area. And because of this large amount of surface area, we absorb 99.9% of every nutrient that we eat. You might not want to, but you do. Right? So the absorption process is really looking at how the cells that are lining the mucosa and facing the food, how those cells take the nutrients in. Right? So there are different transport mechanisms that these cells will use in order to bring the nutrients into the cell. Now don't forget, if we want something to enter the cell, it has to cross the cell membrane. So really we're just talking about cell transport mechanisms across the cell membrane here. So for example, most of the water is absorbed via osmosis. So osmosis involves both the simple diffusion of water right across the cell membrane, but it also involves the facilitated transport of water through water pores called aquaporins. So a lot of water will be absorbed through osmosis at the small intestines, though the large intestine is also capable of water absorption via osmosis. Now hydrophilic nutrients like glucose and amino acids and ions like calcium and sodium, these are absorbed in their smallest forms. So we don't absorb proteins, we absorb amino acids. We don't absorb starch, we absorb glucose. Right? So these are absorbed in their smallest forms, and they're absorbed through the processes of facilitated diffusion and sometimes even active transport. Now the hydrophobic nutrients like lipids and then fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, for example, those are absorbed just via simple diffusion. Now don't forget, anything that's hydrophobic is capable of simply diffusing across the cell membrane. So these hydrophobic nutrients just cross via simple diffusion. Maybe you've heard of celiac disease. Celiac disease is a condition that affects the mucosa of the small intestine. So these individuals basically lose a lot of surface area in their small intestine, making it very difficult to absorb nutrients, and it also produces a lot of problems in the digestive tract like diarrhea and pain and various other things. Celiac disease is actually an autoimmune disease, and with any autoimmune disease, what's happening is that you start to attack yourself. Your defensive cells start to attack yourself. And this is thought to be related to a protein in a lot of food products called gluten. So some individuals will experience celiac disease because of exposure to gluten. So usually celiac disease involves production of an antibody that is capable of binding to and attacking gluten, but it also causes attacking of our own self cells, and hence the destruction of that mucosa of the small intestine. Related, but a little bit different, is a gluten allergy. So someone that has a gluten allergy What's happening there is that when they are exposed to gluten, they go through an allergic response. And what this means is that basically they have a whole bunch of defensive cells waiting in the background, and these defensive cells are chock full of things like histamine. And these defensive cells, if they should bump into their allergen, in this case gluten, when they bump into their allergen, they will release these large amounts of histamine. And this is true for pretty much any type of allergy. You have these defensive cells waiting in the background full of histamine, and if they bump into their allergen, whether it's pollen or gluten or whatever it might be, they release these vast amounts of histamine. And then if this happens in the digestive tract due to the presence of gluten, this will cause lots of inflammation in the small intestine, which can create a lot of discomfort and a lot of problems absorbing nutrients in the small intestine.